For 8 straight years, José Raúl Capablanca did not lose a single game of serious chess, a streak running from 1916 to 1924 that stretched across more than 60 contests against the strongest players alive. The Cuban-born champion sat at the board in places like Havana, New York, London, and St. Petersburg, dismantling grandmasters with a calm that bordered on indifference, as though defeat were a possibility that simply did not apply to him. So how does a man become, for the better part of a decade, almost literally impossible to beat? To answer that, we have to start with the strange and almost suspicious ease of it all. Most chess prodigies fight their way up through years of study, swallowing thick books of opening theory, memorizing endgame tables, drilling tactics until their eyes blur. Capablanca, by every credible account, didn't. He was born in Havana in 1888, the son of a Spanish army officer, and the legend that follows him everywhere is that he learned the game at the age of 4 simply by watching his father play. According to the story, the boy pointed out that his father had made an illegal move, then beat him in a game shortly after, having never been taught the rules formally. We should be careful here because this is exactly the kind of origin myth that grows in the retelling, and Capablanca himself was not above polishing his own legend. But what is documented is dramatic enough. By 12, he had beaten the Cuban national champion Juan Corzo in a match 12 years old, defeating the best player in his country, in a country that already took chess seriously. That part is real. What made Capablanca terrifying wasn't just talent in the abstract. It was the way he played, which seemed to violate the unwritten rules of how hard chess was supposed to be. While his rivals burned through their clock time, calculating long forcing sequences, he would glance at a position and simply know what to do. Contemporaries describe him playing rapidly, almost lazily, leaning back, looking around the room, and still finding the strongest move. This was the era of the mechanical chess clock, introduced in tournament play in the 1880s, and by Capablanca's time, a fixed feature of competition. And the clock was supposed to punish anyone who couldn't calculate quickly. For most masters, time pressure was where games were lost. For Capablanca, the clock was almost irrelevant because he barely used it. That alone unsettled opponents before a single piece had been exchanged. But raw speed only matters if it's accurate. And here we hit the central mystery. How was he so fast and so right at the same time? The answer that emerges from studying his games is that Capablanca didn't really calculate the way other players did. He pursued clarity. Where other masters of the period, raised on the romantic tradition of sacrifice and complication, sought to create chaos and outcalculate their opponents in the fog, Capablanca did the opposite. He simplified. He traded pieces, straightened out the position, removed complications, and steered the game toward clean technical endings where his superior understanding of basic structures gave him an unshakable edge. He once said in a remark that has followed him ever since, that he saw only one move, the best one. Whether or not he literally meant that, it captures something true. His genius was not in finding hidden tactics, but in never needing them. To understand why this was so devastating, you have to understand the chess world he stepped into. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were dominated by a tension between two schools of thought. The older Romantic style prized attack, gambits, and brilliant sacrifices, the kind of swashbuckling chess that filled newspaper columns and thrilled spectators in smoke-filled clubs. Then came Wilhelm Steinitz, the first official world champion, who in the 1880s and 1890s argued against fierce resistance that chess was governed by principles, accumulate small advantages. Don't attack until the position justifies it. Defend accurately and the attacker will run out of fuel. Steinitz turned chess from an art of inspiration into something closer to a science, and his ideas were sharpened further by Siegbert Tarrasch, the German doctor whose dogmatic rules about pawn structure and piece activity became gospel for a generation. Capablanca arrived as the perfect natural expression of this positional revolution, except that he seemed to understand it instinctively without the dogma, without the lectures. What Tarrasch preached, Capablanca simply was. His breakthrough on the world stage came in 1909, and it was brutal. The American champion Frank Marshall, a strong and aggressive player who had competed for the world title, agreed to a match against the young Cuban, expecting to handle him. Capablanca won the match by an enormous margin, winning 8 games, drawing 14, and losing only 1. Marshall was no amateur. He was one of the best players in the world, and he was crushed by a 21-year-old who had no formal chess education, and who treated the whole thing as though it were obvious. The chess world took notice, but the real test was still to come, and Marshall, to his great credit, was the one who pushed for it. That test was the tournament at San Sebastian in 1911. This was one of the strongest tournaments ever assembled to that point, a gathering of nearly all the world's elite masters in the elegant Spanish resort town. Capablanca had never played in a major international tournament. Some of the established masters objected to his being invited at all, arguing that he hadn't earned a place among the elite, that a single match win over Marshall didn't qualify him. The Russian master Osip Bernstein and the Polish-French master Aaron Nimzowicz were among those reportedly skeptical of the newcomer. So what did Capablanca do? He won the tournament, first place ahead of the entire field in his international debut. And in a detail history loves, he defeated Bernstein, one of the men who had questioned his right to be there, in a brilliant game that won the tournament's brilliancy prize. The unknown Cuban had walked into the strongest tournament in the world and walked out on top. The question was no longer whether he belonged, the question was whether anyone could stop him. The answer for a very long time was no. After San Sebastian, Capablanca's reputation grew into something almost mythic. He toured, he gave simultaneous exhibitions where he played dozens of opponents at once and rarely lost, and he carried himself with an aristocratic ease that fed the legend. He was handsome, charming, multilingual, a fixture in high society, and he held a sinecure from the Cuban government that essentially paid him to be a chess-playing diplomat and ambassador for his country. This mattered because chess in this era had no prize money structure to support a professional. Players relied on patronage, on wealthy backers, on tournament organizers, and on the chess columns of major newspapers, which paid for coverage and analysis. Capablanca's diplomatic position freed him from the financial grind that wore down other masters, and it let him approach the board without desperation. He didn't need to win to eat. That detachment, that ease, became part of his weapon. By this point, his style had crystallized into something opponents found almost demoralizing to face. Imagine sitting across from him. You play your opening, you reach a roughly balanced middle game, and then move by move, you notice that your position is getting slightly worse for reasons you can't quite pin down. There's no single blunder, no dramatic attack to defend against. He just keeps making moves that are a fraction better than yours, trading off pieces when it suits him until you find yourself in an endgame a pawn down, or with a structural weakness that can't be fixed. And then the technique begins. Capablanca's endgame play was, by common consensus, among the finest in the history of the game. He understood king and pawn endings, rook endings, the coordination of minor pieces, with a precision that turned tiny advantages into wins with the inevitability of gravity. Other players could survive a bad position against most opponents. Against Capablanca, a slightly worse position was often a death sentence because he never let go. And then came the streak. From February 1916 to March 1924, across tournament games and serious play against the elite of the chess world, Capablanca did not lose. 8 years. More than 60 games at the highest level. Think about what that means psychologically, not just for him, but for everyone who had to face him. Players walked to the board already half defeated, knowing that their realistic best outcome was a draw, that a win was nearly fantasy, and that any small mistake would be punished without mercy. The streak became a kind of force field. It changed how people played against him, often pushing them into passive, cautious choices that played directly into his hands, because a defensive opponent gives a positional master exactly the kind of game he wants. In the middle of this run came the prize he had been circling for years. In 1921 in Havana, Capablanca finally played a match for the World Championship against Emanuel Lasker, the German mathematician and philosopher who had held the title since 1894, an astonishing 27-year reign. Lasker was no positional purist. He was a fighter and a profound practical psychologist who, some claimed, deliberately played objectively inferior moves because they posed the most difficult practical problems to a specific opponent. Lasker had outlasted everyone, but by 1921 he was in his early 50s, and the match was played in Capablanca's home city in the Cuban heat, under conditions that did the older man no favors. The result was a kind of quiet demolition. Capablanca won 4 games, lost none, and the rest were drawn, with Lasker eventually resigning the match before its scheduled completion, citing his health and the climate. There was no single brilliant slaughter, no immortal sacrifice. There was just the relentless accumulation of small advantages, the trading down into superior endings, the technique that never failed. The man who could not be beaten was now officially the best player in the world. What followed was the high water mark of his aura, the tournament that more than any other earned him the nickname the chess machine. London 1922 brought together a fearsome field, and Capablanca won it, finishing ahead of a rising young Russian-French master named Alexander Alekhine, ahead of the great strategist Akiba Rubinstein, ahead of Nimzowitsch, ahead of all of them. He was the reigning champion, playing like a champion, and the chess world began to wonder, half seriously, whether the game itself might be running out of mystery, whether Capablanca had solved chess so thoroughly that top-level play would dissolve into endless draws. He himself floated this idea, suggesting that the game might be reaching a draw death at the highest level and proposing variants with larger boards and extra pieces to revive the complexity. This was the supreme confidence of a man who had not lost in years and who believed, perhaps reasonably, that he had seen to the bottom of the game. But here is where the story turns, because the very qualities that made Capablanca impossible to beat carried inside them the seeds of his vulnerability. His genius was natural, intuitive, effortless, and that meant he didn't work the way obsessive students of the game worked. He didn't bury himself in opening preparation. He relied on understanding rather than memorization, on seeing the right move rather than having analyzed it at home the night before. For most of his career, this was an overwhelming advantage. But the chess world was changing, and a new kind of opponent was emerging, one who would treat preparation not as a supplement to talent, but as a weapon to be forged in private over months and years. That opponent was Alexander Alekhine. The streak finally ended in March 1924 at the great New York tournament, where Capablanca lost to none other than Richard Reti, one of the leading figures of the hypermodern movement. The hypermodernists, Reti and Nimzowitsch chief among them, were challenging the very positional principles Capablanca embodied, arguing that you didn't need to occupy the center with pawns, but could instead control it from a distance with pieces, inviting the opponent to overextend. Reti's opening, beginning with a quiet flank move, was a deliberate provocation, a refusal to play the kind of clean, classical chess Capablanca had mastered. And in that game, Capablanca for once lost the thread. The 8-year wall came down. He still won the New York tournament overall, finishing ahead of both Lasker and Alekhine. So his supremacy was hardly shattered, but the spell of invincibility was broken. And there was one man watching very, very closely. Alexander Alekhine was in temperament, almost the opposite of Capablanca. Where the Cuban was relaxed, social, and seemingly lazy in his preparation, Alekhine was intense, ferociously hardworking, and obsessive. He studied Capablanca's games with the focus of a man preparing to take down a fortress, looking for the cracks in a style that everyone else regarded as flawless. He understood that you could not out-talent Capablanca. You could not simply outplay him at the board in a fair fight, because nobody had managed that in years. Instead, you had to change the nature of the fight. You had to bring deep preparation. You had to steer games into the kind of complicated, double-edged positions that demanded long calculation rather than serene judgment. And above all, you had to be patient, because the way to beat a man who never blundered was to play matches long enough that even a tiny imperfection in his consistency could be exploited. Alekhine also believed something crucial, that Capablanca's confidence had curdled into complacency, that the champion's certainty he could not be beaten had made him stop fighting at full intensity. The two finally met for the World Championship in Buenos Aires in 1927. Almost no one expected Alekhine to win. Capablanca was the heavy favorite, in part because in their tournament games up to that point, Capablanca had the better record and had never lost to Alekhine. The match would be long, the first to win 6 games draws, not counting a grueling format that rewarded stamina and will as much as brilliance, and what unfolded over those months in Argentina was one of the great upsets in chess history. Alekhine won the very first game, a psychological shock that punctured the aura of invincibility from the start. The match dragged on, game after game, many of them drawn, both men exhausted, the tension enormous. But Alekhine's preparation held, his fighting spirit never flagged, and Capablanca faced for the first time in his life with an opponent who simply would not break, and who had studied him more deeply than he had studied himself, could not find the decisive edge. After 34 games, Alekhine won 6 to Capablanca's 3. The chess machine had been defeated, not by greater talent, but by greater hunger and harder work. And here, the human tragedy enters the story. Capablanca expected a rematch. It was the gentlemanly expectation of the era that a deposed champion deserved a chance to win his title back, and Capablanca pressed for one for years. But Alekhine, having climbed the mountain, was in no rush to risk it against the one man on earth who might genuinely beat him. He set financial and organizational conditions for a rematch that proved impossible to meet, especially as the Great Depression dried up the patronage and prize funds that such matches required, and he chose instead to defend his title against less dangerous challengers. The rematch never happened. Capablanca, the man who had been impossible to beat, spent the rest of his career as a former champion, still enormously strong, still capable of brilliant results, but denied the one thing he wanted most. The two men became bitter rivals, their relationship poisoned by the unplayed rematch, and they barely spoke for years. There is a final, poignant chapter. In 1936, nearly a decade after losing his title, Capablanca won the great tournament at Nottingham, one of the strongest of the decade, sharing first place with the rising Mikhail Botvinnik and finishing ahead of Alekhine, ahead of the reigning ideas of the new generation. It was proof that the old magic was still there, that even past his prime he could beat the best in the world. But his health was failing. He suffered from high blood pressure, and on March 7, 1942, while watching a game at the Manhattan Chess Club in New York, he collapsed from a stroke and died the next day. He was 53, the man whose play had always seemed effortless, whose mind had moved through chess positions with the smoothness of flowing water, was gone, and the chess world mourned a genius who had, in a real sense, made the game look too easy. So why was Capablanca impossible to beat for those 8 extraordinary years? The honest answer is that he combined a gift that may never be fully explained with a style perfectly suited to exploiting it. He saw the truth of a position faster and more clearly than anyone, and he had the discipline to chase clarity rather than glory, to win with technique rather than fireworks, to convert tiny advantages with flawless endgame play. He didn't beat opponents so much as he gradually proved to them that they had already lost, but the same effortlessness that made him untouchable also made him, in the end, vulnerable to a man who refused to rely on talent alone, who treated chess as a battlefield to be prepared for in secret over months of study. Alekhine's victory in 1927 was a turning point in the history of the game, the moment when deep scientific preparation began to overtake pure intuition at the very top, a lesson the Soviet school would carry to its peak in the decades that followed. And perhaps that's the deepest thing Capablanca's story tells us about mastery. There is a kind of genius so natural that it seems to transcend effort, that makes the hardest things look simple, and we are right to marvel at it. But there is also a kind of greatness that comes from refusing to accept that anyone is unbeatable, from studying the perfect machine until you find the one place to strike. Capablanca showed the world what natural genius could do. Alekhine showed the world that genius could be hunted down by will. Both men in their way were right. And chess has lived in the tension between them ever since, between the player who sees the best move instantly and the player who works through the night to make sure he never misses it. The chess machine ran flawlessly for nearly a decade. It took a man willing to outwork a god to finally switch it off.